Welcome to all of you, beginning and not so beginning gardeners, I'm sure. As Jing Jing said, this is part of Seed to Supper program that New York State started in 2017, and it's based on a program that the Oregon Food Bank and Oregon State University Extension Services used. It's been adapted to fit, there were a few things changed to fit our area. Our growing area is a little different than the one in Oregon. So just a few housekeeping things. Please feel free to type any questions you have into the chat box. And Jing Jing, if you would keep an eye on that and interrupt me if there's something that is appropriate right then, or we wait until the end to answer some of them, I'm sure. If you think of things afterwards, this is my email, pwiedema2001@yahoo.com. It's PWEIDEMA 2001. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about soil or composting. And you can also always call our Master Gardener hotline, which the number is here, but it's also at the end of the program. I'm going to talk about the Chemung County Cooperative Extension webpage that has the number on it, and also a lot of information. You should be looking at that to answer many of your questions, but other ones, feel free to contact us about. Today's topic, this is again the second in the series. It's getting started with healthy soil, and we're going to talk about choosing your site, building healthy soil, making compost, making garden beds, and continuing to improve and protect your soil. So who I am, my name is, again, Peg Wiedemann. I'm a retired high school librarian. I've been a CCE Master Gardener volunteer for 5 years. And I want to stress that sometimes I think the master is a little intimidating. No one is truly a master gardener, because this is one of the things I love about gardening, is there's always more to learn. I've had 4 years through Tompkins County. I took their Master Composter program, and so I qualify as a Master Composter. And I'm passionate about soil and composting. Those are my big things. Don't ask me about vermicomposting. My brother rolls his eyes and says, I'm going to get a t-shirt that says, my sister has worms. I worm compost. So this is my garden. Actually, this is a picture from a few years ago. It was a peak year, I have to say. It doesn't always look like this. I live in downtown Elmira, so I don't have a ton of space.
Oh, Pat,
so
sorry, I think you haven't shared your screen yet.
Oh my gosh. Hold on. Thank you. Yeah. Oh dear. So I've been talking all this time and I haven't shared my screen. Okay. So let me go back. So this is my garden in downtown Elmira. Can you see that now? So as you can see, I squeeze in a small space. And so that's one of the reasons my concern is with healthy soil, because you can only do this if you have really healthy soil. Now, I have been gardening in this space. I've lived in this house for 35 years. I've been gardening in this space probably for 15 years. So, you can't have something like this overnight. It does take some time. Notice I do some alternative kinds of garden. I have window boxes. I have I even garden in, I always forget to mention this because I read this someplace and it's so cool. Live locally. We have a Big Lots here in Elmira, and they sell bags of composted manure. I think it's Miracle Grow puts them out. And I have a spot where there is some sun. I'm always looking for spots in my garden for some sun. I actually just took a bag of that. I've done it a couple of times and punched some, I cut a little bit through the top. I punched some holes all the way through for drainage, and I planted right in the bag. So you can do that. I actually grew some pumpkins out of that. So you can garden in anything, any way, anyhow, as long as you meet the plant's needs. And the plant's needs are for healthy soil. So first of all, choosing your site. One of the things that limits me the most is sunlight and tree roots. I can't convince my neighbors to cut down their trees, unfortunately. And since that picture was taken a few years back, their trees are bigger and their roots really like my soil. So I'm having more trouble. I'm going to be using more things like that bag and pot, do grow in pots also. So those are some alternatives. Sunlight is necessary. You have to have some sun. So sunlight is the first thing. You'll get to know your soil. You'll actually get to know, I find it really fascinating that over the years I've gotten to know little spots in my yard that have special qualities. Like I have a few protected, very sheltered spots where I can, we're in a zone 5B here in Elmira, but I have a spot that's really almost a 6B, so it's quite a bit warmer than other spots because it's so sheltered and it's near the house. So I can grow things that I wouldn't normally think of growing in a 5B. So you really get to know your land. You need to observe it. As you garden, you will get to know, oh, wait, this spot is too cold for this, or this spot gets a little more sun, so I can grow this plant here. This is shadier, so I can grow, say, greens. Lettuce particularly can take shade and actually likes it in the middle of the winter or the summer during the hottest time. So you'll get to know, these are things that take time to learn. This is one of the joys of gardening, is always learning. Good airflow is important. I have pretty good airflow, but I also have some protection. So as we have higher winds than we used to, really kind of a fence that it's not completely enclosed, but it does help a little bit with, I'm going to close my other stuff here so I'm unstable, so that it doesn't get really windy, but there is enough airflow. I'm also lucky in some ways that I can close off my yard so that deer, even in the city now, we're starting to have some trouble with deer, so that when my garden is at peak, I don't have deer coming down my driveway and into my garden, which I did one year actually. It's also, you want to make sure your garden is someplace that you're going to be walking by, that isn't in the back 40, because this is going to be probably, if this is your vegetable garden we're talking about, it's going to be like a kitchen garden. You want to be able to zip out and pick some parsley or those chives or whatever. So it's not so far away. And it's also something that, you know, if it's on your way to the garage, which mine is, which is great, walk by it a couple of times a day. So you're kind of always keeping an eye on it and making sure things don't get out of hand, because I'll tell you, weeds are the best thing to help with weeds is to be on top of it all the time. To let it go, it becomes a huge project. Also, you want to avoid problem spots. So if you have a spot in your yard that is swampy or always wet, it's probably not going to be a good spot for your garden unless um, you decide, okay, I'm going to work on this area for a few years and make it a good spot for my garden. You know, you can change that, but it takes time. But you can't change the sunlight unless you can get your neighbors to cut down some trees. So sunlight, soil, air, convenience, and avoiding problem spots. So again, gardens need sunlight. They need at least 6 hours of sun. And I kind of would say you're probably not going to be able to, if you only get 6 hours of sun, you're going to have trouble with things like corn and tomatoes. You could grow beans, herbs, lettuces, probably other greens, and maybe broccoli, something like that. All of those can take maybe slightly less than 6 hours sun, but tomatoes and corn really need sun. So shade-free. If you have a slope, it should be a gradual slope. Otherwise, you would have to terrace it, and that's a whole method of gardening that we're probably not going to have time to get into. So minimum of 6 hours of sun, open light. If it should have a southern exposure, a southern shade-free exposure, and if you have a slope, a gradual slope. Getting to know your soil should drain well, and the way you can test that is to dig a little hole and fill it with water and see how long the water takes to absorb into the soil. You know, and obviously it's a problem again. Just as I said, you can work on that. If it has weeds and they're healthy, that's actually a good sign. That means you have soil that stuff can grow in. If it's just bare soil, nature really tries hard to cover bare soil, so that doesn't bode well. Then definitely your soil is going to need some work. Good airflow, natural breezes help keep away disease. A lot of fungus diseases and fungal diseases are caused by moisture remaining on the leaves. It's really important not to have leaves that stay wet for long periods of time, because particularly late blight blows in on the breeze and it's looking for wet leaves. And once it finds them, it's a happy camper. It's gonna move in. So make sure that particularly it gets some morning sun so that the dew will dry up as quickly as possible. Sun and breeze. Make sure it's convenient, again, out of sight, out of mind, and put your garden where you can enjoy it. See that, now that's a bad spot. That soil is not absorbing the moisture. There's a low wet area there, or an area, a creek. Jing has a lovely creek way behind her house, which she's got woods there and wildflowers, but it wouldn't make a good vegetable garden. Really, really windy areas will cause some problems, like blowing your tomato plants over, you know, possibly just too much wind. can cause a problem. And areas with lead paint, some of us with old houses that, you know, have been painted before 1970, there might be some lead right around the house. I do have a garden area right up against my house, but I use it to plant perennials instead of vegetables, because there are some vegetables will take up that lead, and you want to avoid that in your food. So an area like this would need a lot of improving, either that or find a different spot. Building healthy soil. There's healthy soil. While they can grow plants in, there was this aquaculture that they grow plants in water, or hydroculture. I'm a big person myself. I think plants in soil tend to have a lot less problems. The more ways you try to tinker with that, like growing in pots, everything makes it exponentially harder. A plant soil can fix some of its own problems. Its roots can move a little bit. It has access to water in different spots of the garden, whereas a plant in a pot is dependent. It's like a baby. You have to take care of it more. Your good soil is loamy. It does two things. It actually holds the moisture, but it drains well. It's almost contradictory, but it does both. And it warms up early in the spring. And part of that is because it has the soil spaces, because it's not dried and cracked. It's not hard to dig. It's not hard like this where it doesn't absorb water, it just runs off. That's poor soil. That's going to need a lot of work. So what we don't think about is soil. A good part of it is air. You don't think of plants' roots needing air, but they do. Soil is roughly 1/2 pore space, good soil. So that soil that we just looked at that was all hard and cracked is lacking that air space. And if it lacks that space, water will sit on top of it or sheet off of it because it can't get down into the soil. Also probably lacking organic matter. Organic matter is something that gardeners talk about that I think puzzles people who aren't to gardening, but you'll hear us talk about compost, organic matter, and that's basically just things that were once living that we put on the soil. So in the woods, in the forest, it's leaves and twigs and stuff like that. That's the natural thing that nature does to put organic matter in the soil. We do a similar kind of thing by composting. And soil itself is just broken pieces of rock. And it can be different kinds of rock depending on what part of the country you live in. If you live in an area that has a lot of limestone, your soil is going to be broken up pieces of limestone, which is very alkaline, okay, which is more likely out in the central country, not so much around here, although I suppose there probably are specific areas around here that have that. If you have, as I said, broken pieces of rock, if your soil is just big chunks of rock, plants are going to have trouble with that if it's just entirely rock. Or I grew up on an island that soil was sand. My poor dad had a tough time getting things to grow in that. So I think in general, we're fortunate in this area. I think most of us tend to have, if we have a problem with soil, it's most likely to be clayey soil. But clayey soil, actually, it's basically good soil. It just needs some more air holes in it, because that clay kind of presses down into itself, particularly if it gets compacted at all. So compaction, this is a big thing with me. One of the things that causes poor soil is compaction. It could be perfectly good soil, but if you put a lot of weight on it, like parking your truck or whatever, or using heavy equipment, if you have a newly built home where the land was graded, this may be a problem. You may have compacted soil around your house. There are ways to improve compacted soil. The trick is, once you've improved it, don't walk on it. The less that you disturb that, put pressure on that soil, the better it's going to stay. So it's best to make permanent beds for your plants and permanent paths to walk in. So ideally, you would not have to walk in your garden bed at all. Okay, so here's where they tell you organic matter is anything that was once living and is decomposed in the soil. It's a small amount, but it's very important. Now they say 2%. I would say at least 2%. I like higher, actually. So your soil is 25, ideally 25% water, 25% air, and broken rock or dirt or whatever you want to call it. So make sure that you have that portion and that you have that organic matter in there, because that's what keeps it open and actually creates, organic matter actually creates what's called aggregates. The bacteria, the worms, the microorganisms in the soil, they actually secrete this almost like glue-like substance that makes the soil sort of hold together a little bit, not like clay, but hold together enough so that with air spaces in it, so that things like the roots and the water can penetrate. So organic matter is anything broken down by worms and microorganisms before it goes into your garden as compost. So you're putting organic matter into your compost pile if you have one, and I highly recommend that gardeners should have a compost pile. Over time, and it does take some time, it will turn into this organic, this composted soil looking material that is basically alive. Okay, it has worms in it, it has lots of things that we don't even see. And this is something that is finally it's finally getting some attention from scientists. Is we tend to, over the last years, we tend to think about dirt as just something that the plants went in, and then we'd provide the NPK, the nitrogen, potassium, and phosphate that the plants need to grow. And it was almost like it was this thing that you could ignore the soil because we were adding these other things to it. But in fact, plants need, just in the same way that our gut microorganism allows us to digest foods, soil is working in the same way. It has lots of microorganisms in it that the plants cannot, that kind of feed the plant. They have a sort of symbiotic relationship with these bacteria and living organisms, where the plants the roots exude this sugar that the microorganisms like, and in return, the microorganisms turn this undigestible carbon and nitrogen into a form that the plant take up. And if you use a lot of chemicals on your garden, or if you do a lot of disturbance of the soil, you are upsetting that balance. So always keep that in mind when you're doing different things to your garden. Okay, there is life in there, we hope, unless you're working with really poor soil, in which case you kind of need to start from scratch and put the life in there. But so doing things like adding compost each year will help maintain that structure. So every year it increases soil organic matter, which actually gets used up. So you do need to put it on every year. I've gotten to the point now, well, because of the compost, it's kind of like a sponge. It both holds water and helps drainage. So wonderful for clayey soils. It contains and attracts beneficial organisms, and it protects the environment because it keeps any nutrients in the soil from running off into the streams, and they're really not needed and can do some harm. So those are some of the reasons for compost. So as again, I'm a compost evangelist. I recommend that you make your own compost, at least some of it. And it will take time to build up any, it takes time to make compost. It takes time to build it up and build up your soil. So, you know, you may purchase some as well. But you should be able to make your own compost. Particularly, you can get your neighbors to chip in too. There is quite a bit of good information on the website that the Cornell Extension that talks about making your own compost. But there are so many advantages to doing it, and you can do it at many levels. You can do it, frankly, you can do it. My dad used to keep a leaf pile, and it was just leaves. It took years to break down. It's actually got a name when it's broken down. It's called leaf mold, and it is particularly beneficial. It does take a very long time to break down, though, but that's one way to compost, and it's pretty trouble-free. It probably would have gone faster if he had turned it at all and maybe sprinkled some blood meal on it, which is a high nitrogen thing that might have helped it work a little faster. And also, the finer you chop the leaves, the faster they will melt down. I actually collect my leaves in the fall, and I collect them with my leaf vac, which sucks it up, chops them up, and shoots them into a bag. So they're nice and small, and I just put them right on my garden beds, actually, in the fall. And by summer, they have pretty much worked their way down into the soil. In fact, I have seen this. I love this cool movie on PBS about soil that actually they caught a video of an earthworm pulling a whole leaf down into the soil, and I thought that was just so cool. Earthworms are amazing. They are like little rototillers in your soil. So if you have earthworms, you're in good shape. You want to do everything you can to encourage worms. So here's actually how I kind of made my bin like this. My bin is actually on the ground. I don't have, he appears to have a bottom, his raised compost pile. I have mine right on the ground. I have two bins, and I just basically got some pallets everywhere. You see them outside some store, you go in and ask them if you can have them, and for me it worked. They gave it to me. And some fence posts, some metal fence posts to hold them up. Mine's not quite as tall as his, Ideally, you have 3 by 3 is much the ideal size, or the smallest size you want to make a working compost pile. You want it to be exposed to air. You can use those bins. I'll talk about that in a minute. And basically, what I do is I have one of my bins is a working bin where I'm putting my food scraps and my trimmings and my seedless weeds. I don't worry too much about getting a hot compost because I don't put anything that has seeds in it, anything that I wouldn't want to grow. I put tomato seeds, but weed seeds I don't put in there. If a weed is actually going to seed, I clip off the seed part and put it in the trash or the compost that I take to the compost facility. And then I throw the rest into the compost bin.
Oh, Pat, we have one question.
Huh?
So Karen was wondering if there's much of a difference between the barrel turning type of composters and just putting scraps in a heap.
Good question. So the detail, the general picture of making compost is 4 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen is the good mix. Okay. So carbon would be things like dead organic matter, like dried leaves, straw, sawdust. And the nitrogen would be closer to living green leaves, kitchen scraps. So 4 to 1 in your compost pile. Now, if you're using an enclosed thing like one of those turnable bins, a couple of tips for those is, okay, first of all, just like growing a plant in a pot, you have to, because it's enclosed and it's like a baby, it doesn't have any forgiveness there. If it gets too wet, it's harder for it to dry out, unlike the outdoor compost. If it gets too dry, it's not going to get the rain. So you've got to provide the moisture or the lack thereof. So if it's too wet, you have to put more dry stuff. Also, because it's not on the ground, when you start it up, I would put a shovel full of soil in there, because the soil is where the microorganisms come from that work in the compost, okay, that are going to turn your stuff into compost. Oh, I forgot, another source of carbon is newspaper, if you shred it, if you have a shredder or something like that. So yeah, there are different ways to compost. There are some ways that say that you can make compost in 6 weeks. I'm gonna stretch. I'm saying that's really pushing it. You can speed it up by paying a lot of attention to it, making sure you get your balance exactly right, and turning it a lot to get the air in and making sure the moisture is just right. So you can speed up. It's more work. I've gotten to the point now where I don't turn mine at all, actually. I use last year's compost, the one like over here, and I put it through a strainer to get out any big bits. I have a framed wire thing that I put over my wheelbarrow that I just toss the compost on top there and get the big chunks out, throw them working side, and then once I've emptied out that one side, I turn over the other side. So and by next year, it'll be again. So I use my compost once a year. I put it on my vegetable garden and my perennial garden, although less heavily. I put a few inches on my vegetable garden in the fall, and I don't even turn it in anymore. I just, between the rain, the snow, the earthworms, it pretty works itself into the soil. So I don't worry about that. So I'm a lazy gardener. I try to make it as simple as possible. During the winter, my compost is quite a ways back in my yard. It's behind my garage. So I do just put things in a trash can that I have on my back porch, where it freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, and then I take it out once the snow melts. I take it back to the compost pile and put it on, because your compost will not do much in the winter. It slows down considerably. The bacteria slow down when it's cold. So things do slow down. And that's why, just a little ad here, that's why I like to vermicompost. So most of my food scraps in the winter go to my worms. And that's a different kind of compost. And hopefully I'll be offering a vermicomposting class again soon, because I just think it's awesome.
Pat,
Building,
sorry.
yeah.
There's another question. Carol's also wondering how you keep pests away from the compost.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. When you have an open compost pile like that, particularly if you're out someplace in the open, yeah, you might have trouble with animals. You can make sure you bury any food scraps in the middle of the pile so it's not so attractive. I have started, I basically do most of my kitchen scraps now go to my vermicompost inside the house. So I don't put attractive food scraps out in my open compost pile. I do put things that the worms don't like onion peels and orange peels and grapefruit and things like that, and coffee grounds in my outdoor compost pile. They tend not to attract animals, so I don't have a problem. So as you can see here, you add browns and greens and alternating layers. I'm not too religious about that. I kind of bury my greens in the leaves, and I keep a few bags of leaves. So if I have a lot of greens once, I can take one of those bags and dump it on top. I don't water much unless we have a really bad dry spell, but my compost pile is under a tree, so it's under an evergreen tree. So, and it's behind the garage, so it doesn't dry out very much. It pretty much stays nicely damp. Yeah, and you continue until the pile is 3 feet high, and you can let it sit, and then you can turn it if you want, but you don't have to. It will eventually decompose anyway. It just takes longer. So they give you the tips here on what counts as carbon. Remember, it's going to be a ratio of 4 to 1. You can get really granular about this. There's stuff on the internet. If you are one of those people that wants to make really fast compost and is willing to put in the work and calculate different things, you can do that. Or you can just kind of eyeball it and say, okay, that's about 4 times to 1 time. So those are the things, these are the things that are nitrogen, these are the things that are carbon. Make sure that you will have a pest problem if you put meat, dairy, bones. Don't put disease plants and weed seeds in the compost pile unless you're one of those people that's going to make it a perfect compost pile where you're going to heat up to, and you're going to have a compost thermometer and heat up to 160 degrees. That will kill diseases and weed seeds. Now, if you live in Chemung County, you can get a kind of raw compost for free from the Chemung County Compost Facility. And you can also take your weed seeds and your yeast plants over there. It's behind the old Kmart. It's the hours are online. It's free if you're a Chemung County resident. I periodically keep those things that I don't want to put on my pile in a dirt bag, actually, and go there and take a few bags with me, and I get some of their compost. They have a chipper that is able to chip whole trees. They do triple shred their compost, but it is rough. It's not the kind of compost that I would put directly on my vegetable garden. I do use it in my perennial garden, and I would put it on my compost pile to let it decompose some more. So, and if you have a truck, they have a loader there. They'll actually load it right into your truck. So that's a good freebie. So when you turn your pile, as I said, some people do it monthly, some people do it more often. They're really in a hurry. Basically a matter of forking the stuff from one bin to the other, and it will heat up again every time you turn the stuff in. That stuff is still decomposing, and it's the decomposition that makes the heat. If you go to the Chemung County compost facility at this time of year in particular, you will actually see steam coming off their piles, because those are working compost piles. Taking the finished compost, and this is what I like as finished compost. I want the really fine stuff where everything is broken down. If it's rough and it's still breaking down, it's actually going to pull nitrogen out of the soil for the process of breaking that wood chips or whatever is in there down. So that's why I like it to be already decomposed. Add 2 to 6 inches. I add 2 to 3 inches in the fall, but you can do it in the spring, and you may want to then mix or wiggle it in. If you do it in the fall, you really don't need to worry about that. And I do, in the next few weeks, I'll be taking what remains of last year's compost and throwing it on top of my perennial gardens, just a small amount, less than an inch, actually. I do throw on top of the perennial gardens. Okay, so what kind of garden are you gonna?
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
So Amy was wondering if you can recommend a good compost fork, something like sturdy but lightweight for a short lady.
Okay, I have 2 forks, and one of them is what I call my compost fork, which I believe is actually a hay fork. I got it from Tractor Supply, and it is lighter. I also have what I've heard called fork. I call it my spading fork. If you're digging in soil that has roots or rocks in it, it's a wonderful digging tool that I prefer to a shovel, actually. So yeah, a hay fork makes a good compost fork. A garden fork or a sturdier digging fork makes a good replacement for a spade if you have some or roots in your garden. Okay, kinds of garden beds. So the traditional garden bed was rows of one particular type of plant. Maybe this row would be carrots, and this row would be lettuce, and this row, and with walkways in between each row. It's kind of gone out of style. It's really not a very efficient use of space. It was basically designed because it allows you to rototill between the rows. And I think they're really getting away from rototilling, because tilling actually destroys the existing structure of the soil. So it takes a while for the soil to recover. I think it's better to do an intensive garden with walkways in between that are either grass enough to mow, or my walkways between my raised beds are actually, I put down cardboard and wet it because otherwise it's slippery, and put straw over it just for appearance sake. It looks prettier with the straw over it. And every time that diminishes or if weeds start coming up, I put down more cardboard and put straw over it. I'm a neighbor thief. I've been known to steal on garbage night, steal cardboard from different people. Um, Although now we're shopping online, most of us have our own cardboard. And what was it? Oh, I also have been known to, people still put out bagged leaves even though they don't pick up. So I've been known to go pick up people's bagged leaves, or ask them. Sometimes I take them if I see that they're definitely rid of them. Okay, so garden size. So I have to confess that when I made my first garden, I was about 20 years old. I was told I could use this very large space where there had actually been a gardener that lived and worked there and used a tractor. And I don't know, I didn't know any better. I bought a packet of cucumber seeds. I thought you were supposed to plant them all. I ended up with 80 hills of cucumbers. What was I thinking? You know, they talk about people leaving zucchini at people's houses. I was leaving bushels of cucumbers at people's houses. So no, you don't need to pack the entire packet of seeds. Or if you're starting seedlings, you can start them all, but then give the ones that you don't need away. Think about, why are you gardening? You shouldn't plant more than you're going to eat, and you shouldn't plant things that you don't like to eat unless you're planning on donating to the food bank or to the Samaritan Center. Think about who will do the work. It's probably you. How much work do you want to do? How much time do you have? How much room do you have? Best to start small. This year, if it's your first year or your second year, start small, keep it small, and think about the future and what do you like about it and what do you want more of? Oh, I wish I'd planted more of this or whatever. This is a pretty ideal garden setup. This is a raised bed, which this is an awesome size, 3 to 4 feet wide, because you can reach from the path to the center without ever having to step on the garden. Remember I said you don't want to walk on the garden, you don't want to touch that soil. The pathways, well, frankly, I would never use gravel. First of all, it's expensive. And if you decide at some point that you want to change your garden orientation to go the other direction or whatever, you've got all that gravel to get rid of. So I highly recommend the cardboard and straw, or cardboard, and you can get some of those composted wood chips from the Chemung County composting facility. So this is a nice setup, though. I'm not sure, those tomatoes look awfully close together to me. And you'll see what they've done with the lettuce here. They've got these little hoop houses over them. Probably, I wouldn't, my guess would be that it's to shade them a little bit because it's midsummer, because it looks like they've already got their tomatoes up there. It's a nice setup, but it takes some work and some money to get there. And remember, don't walk in the garden. Raised beds. Raised bed is any garden bed that is raised above the ground. And you'll see here, it's just shaped, that's all. There's no retaining wall at all. You can do that. It's very much like a wide row here is the style that they're using, and then they have wood chips in between. Your first time making a raised bed involves some digging. The reason you might want raised beds is it's easier to avoid walking. It saves fertilizer, water, labor, time. You're not watering pathways. You're not putting fertilizers on pathway. You get better drainage because it's a little bit, and it warms up sooner because it's raised. I like how they have 3 people working on that garden. Now here's a very raised bed, and using retaining walls. That's quite a bit of wood there. That's pretty expensive to buy that wood. And eventually it's going to deteriorate, but it allows you to create a special shape. You can use narrower walkways because it's easier to reach in. And if you're not able to bend over, it's much more accessible. The other drawback, I don't know if you noticed, but that soil had to come from someplace. So presumably they had to buy that soil to fill that. That's expensive. So methods for making raised beds. You have your basic, your sheet mulching, or your no-dig method. Basic involves digging. And she's got a digging fork there. You can dig with a shovel, or you can dig with a digging fork. You're going to loosen to a depth of 2 to 3 inches. If you want to spend some money and you have a big space, or you want to go in with friends, you could get what's called a broad fork, which is a very large digging fork that works faster. So you're going to loosen, you're going to spread a 2 to 3 inch layer of compost. This is if you're making your garden, say, as soon as your ground is dry right now. You're going to scatter some, nitrogen fertilizer, I would say. Yeah, nitrogen probably. If it's your first garden, you're probably just going to need nitrogen. You're going to turn it over to about 6 inches deep. You're going to create these 3 to 4 feet wide beds, and you can shovel the pathways between them about 6 inches deep, rake the beds level, and then mulch the paths. You're going to get some really good results. It's hard work though, but you're going to have a nice garden. The second method is sheet mulching. It's inexpensive and it's easy, but you have to do it. You should have done it last fall or if you're going to expand your garden next year. First, you mark out your bed. Just break ground. You don't even have to remove the grass. Put down. You're basically making like a compost pile in a garden shape. I don't know where they got these workers from. If it was my garden, it'd be me. So it's inexpensive. I don't know, easier than digging maybe. The drawback is that it won't be ready to plant until spring. Then the last one is sheet mulch garden beds. This involves a similar kind of thing. I don't know if you really need to weed the area. Just put down cardboard, and then you add pre-made potting soil and plant. Pre-made, that's a lot of bags of potting soil though. So it's expensive, but you can plant in it. Once you've created your bed, the one thing you're going to remember is that you want to always keep the soil covered. If you don't cover it with something, nature will try to cover it with weeds, or get very compacted. So as I said, I put shredded leaves on my gardens. You can put straw on it. You can grow a cover crop, which is a whole other class, actually. You can put mulch and you can remove it in the spring to plant. Here's growing a cover crop. It actually can improve your soil. It can help with certain soil problems. And as I said, I'm not really going to talk about cover crops. There's going to be a workshop on that I think Tompkins County is going to offer one in August. So protecting the life in the soil is less tilling, more organic matter. After a few years, you can wiggle your compost in. I don't even do that. I just put it on top in the fall and let nature do it. Okay, here is the Chemung County Cornell Cooperative Extension website. It's under gardening. And you get all this information here, container gardening, compost resources. There's some excellent compost, deer-resistant plants, food gardening, lawn information, pests, and our workshops and Seed to Supper. And we're always recruiting master gardeners. So if you're learning and you have a little experience, you'll be welcome to join with us. Hopefully we'll be back to getting together in person. We've been doing Zoom things, but each other. Also, hey, I'm a retired librarian. I have to recommend a book titled Square Foot Gardening by Mel Bartholomew. And this is my Bible. I come back to this every once in a while. I'm not an engineer. He was an engineer. I'm not that careful, but I love the principles, and it works even if you don't measure exactly or everything. It gives you some great ideas. And every year I try to implement a few more ideas. So next week, for those of you who are continuing on, which I hope is all of you, it's going to be preparing the soil for planting, fertilizing, do you use seed or transplants, how to direct seed, how to transplant, protecting your plants, and vertical gardening. And thank you to Cornell University Cooperative Extension. Jing, do we have any more questions?
Yes, we do have some questions. So how do you choose straw for the garden? Karen used a straw one year that created tons of weeds.
Okay, make sure that you're buying straw and not hay. Hay has the seed still on it. Straw is better. It doesn't theoretically have the seed heads. It will probably still have some seeds in it. But what I've taken to doing is I buy some bales of straw in the fall and I keep them back behind my garage outside. I let them actually sprout and then I use the straw. So that will keep, and also if you use the cardboard underneath, that helps to keep the grass seed is basically what it is, from sprouting, from actually taking hold. It makes it easy to pull out if it does sprout. So 2 tips there. Yeah, and there are better and worse places. So it actually is probably a good sign if you do get some sprouting from your straw, because that means it hasn't been treated with a pre-emergent herbicide. But if you buy it ahead of time and let it sit for a while, the seed will sprout, and then when you spread it out, those things will die back.
Thank you, Pat. There's another question about broad fork, but I think you have mentioned broad fork in your presentation. So what do you think about using broad fork to loosen up soil early in the season?
I think it's excellent. They're expensive. I don't have one. I use my garden fork. My garden isn't that big, so it would be silly for me to spend the money. But if you have a bigger garden, or if you have a group of people that can go in on the price, I mean, I think they cost more than $100. But they are an excellent tool. And I was actually just watching a Zoom from someone in Tompkins County yesterday. Loves the broad fork. She raves about it. So they're a great soil aerator without doing a lot of damage to the organisms in the soil.